Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Delighted to be here, and I'm hoping that I can shed some light on what for many of us is a difficult subject,
Yeah.
downsizing. So I want to give you some ideas, I hope, and some little bit of my experience. And I should tell you a little bit about myself. On both sides of my family, we've been in southern Alberta for roughly 120, 125 years.
Wow.
Um, on my mother's side, my grandparents were homesteaders and farmed, which I think has some bearing on my attitudes and my ideas about things. Especially, my folks were both born in 1925, and that means they were quite young during the Depression, and I think that's given me a background. And then much closer to what I do, my grandfather came to this country trained as a watchmaker,
Oh, wow.
and they had my grandparents, because my both my grandfather and my grandmother worked together their entire careers. Initially, my grandfather led the charge, but later in life, he was in the background, and my grandmother was an antiques dealer with my grandfather in the background.
Hmm.
And that eventually led to my parents being in a similar business, eventually being involved with the antiques trade. And ultimately, we had an auction sales company, a family auction sales company. And I probably worked my first auction sale maybe at the age of 6 or 7 years old. Um, Said that I would never make a career of it, went off to university, and naturally I came back and joined the family business and made a career of it.
Yeah.
Um, but I was fortunate enough to be able to work with my parents. I worked with both of them. My father uh, doing the business side and the transactions as far as the auctioneering goes. My mother doing the behind the scenes, and I think they both were valuable as to how my career evolved. And ultimately, I became an antiques retailer doing the
Mhm.
occasional estate auction sale, and I condensed my focused from doing everything from soup to nuts, including antiques, but you name it. Eventually, I focused to much more to antiques and art, and then started to do a little bit of media things. I had a radio phone-in show. Um, I
So
was
this is second nature to you.
Yes,
Yeah.
I was an expert on the Canadian Antiques Roadshow for 3 seasons.
Okay. I
Um,
love that show.
and then ultimately, Canadian Pickers came along, and that's probably what I'm best known for. Um, but I'm most proud of my work in the community, and I'm still an auctioneer. Um, I do a lot of benefit auctions. I do appraisals, and both for the public and for a lot of museums and other institutions. And I price for estate sales. So I'm very much involved with the marketplace, and that gives me the basis as to what I'm going to convey as some of the ideas I'm going to come up with
Hmm.
today. Yes.
Perfect. I'm gonna take notes for myself because there's so much going on. Um, okay. Uh, so we've got, that's how you got into the business. So you're very much have your fingers into everything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as far as the industry of antiques and that sort of thing, where do you see that going over the next few years?
Well, sadly, for me especially, because I love antiques, and a lot of my friends and customers obviously do as well.
Yeah.
But sadly, most of the antiques market has been quite decimated,
Mhm.
and several people have their own theories as to how and why that came about. Um, I certainly have watched it happen over a gradual period. And I mentioned that I was a retailer, and I was a retailer for some 15 years,
Mhm.
and I could see the writing was on the wall. And that's why there's very few antique shops. There are some avenues, including um, group shops or mall type affairs, but very few independent antique shops. And a big part of that is because the market is has slipped away in
Mhm.
most cases, especially for certain items, including a lot of the things that I specialized in: furniture, silver, glass, several categories that have just the prices were much higher 20 and 30 years ago than they are today. And in some
Mhm.
instances, the items have nominal value.
Okay.
Um, but there are some exceptions, and that's the bright side of the market. Is certain aspects are still very desirable,
Mhm.
but the bulk of the antiques trade has vanished, and in many instances, I can't see it coming back. So,
Okay.
and in conjunction with that, demographics have changed and people's tastes have changed. I think one of the biggest changes is that sentimentality. So I mentioned my grandparents, and if my grandparents had an item and it eventually came down to me through inheritance, I treasured it. In my instance, I have a lot of those items, too many to treasure because at some point it slips into hoarding as opposed to sentimentality. But
Yeah.
sadly, it used to be that if your grandmother had or your mother had a favorite china service, that was passed down. And today's market, it's there's no interest in it, and um, it's rare to find porcelain, a single teacup in most homes today.
Mhm.
Yeah. So things have changed, demographics have changed, even just the accommodation. People are living in smaller accommodation,
Mhm.
and maybe formal dining is a thing of the past. And if you're going to dine formally, maybe you do that in a restaurant or some other setting.
That's a valid
Um,
point, yeah.
yeah, but so it's really changed the marketplace.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, with that in mind, let's kind of shift over towards the downsizing side of things. And I know you got a couple of topics that you wanted to cover.
Yes.
Do you have anything you want to start with?
Yes. Well, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news.
Hey, we're going for realism today. We're reality checking and
Realism
and
it is.
and
And
and you know what the logistics.
yes. So let me start with the good news. The good news is certain items, and most people are aware of it, but not necessarily, that some of the things that we've acquired over a lifetime have actually become more desirable. And top of mind would be, say, art pieces.
Hmm.
And that's one of the things I specialized in. And I don't think I'm exaggerating if I say that I've sold several thousands. Actually, it would be in the five figures,
Wow,
tens
okay.
of thousands of pieces of artwork over my
Yeah.
career. Now that means calling bids at an auction sale.
Hmm.
And many original artworks have appreciated, and some unbelievably so in the last while. So
Okay.
that's the one of the good news stories.
Hmm.
And I mentioned some of the other areas of the antiques trade, um, signage, advertising, anything to do with oil and gas pumps, and uh, those things have never seen prices like they have today. They've been
Wow.
appreciated maybe more than a lot of the hottest stocks on the stock market. But most of the things, and I would well into the 95 or 98 or 99% of the things that you see in a normal home,
Hmm.
sadly, have not appreciated, and
Hmm.
they become a little more difficult to deal with.
Yeah. I
So
smile because I just did this with my parents and
yes,
it's crushing.
yes, and I dropped into one of my favorite auction houses just the last couple of days and had a long conversation with probably the most dominant auction house in the city of Calgary, and we're talking about in excess of 1.5 million people.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking about the market as the conversation usually comes around to, and we both agreed that there is we are just at the start of a tsunami of merchandise coming to the market. Baby boomers have acquired a lot of things and a lot they've inherited, and but the next generation.
Oh, hang on a sec. I think we just. Okie dokie.
All right,
Shuffle that
back
way,
to it.
smidgen. All right.
Back to it. So as I was just about to say, there's several methods of people downsizing and lightening the load.
Mm-hmm.
And a few of the items are easy to do. If you have a piece of art or that very rare piece of furniture, but very, very rare. Um, Occasionally, people have flatware, cutlery, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And often it's all, as a blanket, referred to as silver. Well, if it actually is sterling silver, no problem. Worst case scenario, there's value in bullion. You'd hate to see your grandmother's sterling melted down, but that's an option. And actually, at today's market rate, roughly $32 US an ounce, and dinner fork can be the better part of an ounce. That can add up to some serious money.
Now that would need to be like solid. It wouldn't plated is totally different.
Correct. Sterling silver, and it's often marked in North America, stamped right on it, sterling. But there's a multitude of ways that it could be marked.
Mm-hmm.
It could be marked 925, which is once again the sterling standard, 92.5% silver, and the balance is not as an alloy.
Mm-hmm.
It could be European and marked 800, 80% silver. But more often than not, it's silver plate.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, with a little bit of knowledge, if it was to say Community or Rogers, or a multitude of, or Viking, or Primrose, if any of those words, if you looked at the back, that means that it's basically a silver plate, a very fine layer of silver over another metal. So no such luck in that one. And the bulk of what I see when I'm pricing for estate sales is silver plate. But every once in a while, somebody's got sterling, and there's good value to sterling, like I say, worst case scenario, just to melt.
Okay.
Jewelry is much like silver. It could have nominal value, and occasionally we come across an estate or a situation where there's some very valuable pieces,
Mm-hmm.
or the combination. That's not unusual either, is to come across a little bit of or a lot of not valuable, and then occasionally there's
Some random in there.
yes. So it helps to have a trained eye,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll speak about that in a little while. But I want to get to several different methods of turning things into space as opposed to taking up space.
Yeah.
And the first one I would talk about is the auction sale idea. Now, sadly, and I am an auctioneer, but sadly, very few auction sales take place with merchandise. Online auctions are the new norm.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reluctant to call them auction sales, and I have this theory
Like
that
silent auctions.
yes,
Yeah.
but in some instances, the art world, for example, they've been very successful, and in fact, very efficient. I could go on, but I won't, other than I will say that the high-end pieces seem to still have a good market regardless of how you're selling things. The middle, which is 99% of the market, the middle to low end, is a difficult challenge. And often you're looking at some additional costs. There's obviously an auctioneer's commission, but there's transportation as well, and sometimes even additional costs to that. So
Mhm.
it's often not so viable unless there's some really good quality pieces involved in the situation.
Okay.
Estate sales, which is a new aspect of the market. And by new, I would say the last 2 decades, maybe 25 years of having sales in one's home. And that's can be, if the situation is right, that can be very effective. Um, More often than not, it's a circumstance where the home is being vacated. It's either been sold, um, but very often, very rarely, I should say, do people have a sale, an estate sale in their home and then continue living there. It's
Mhm.
usually the final method. Now, once again, the criteria would be there has to be enough merchandise there to justify it.
Mhm.
And it certainly helps if, for example, someone was in a larger center. You've got potential clients in the city of Calgary. You've got in excess of 1 million people, potential clients. In a smaller center or rural, it becomes much, much more difficult to conduct a sale.
Is there like general locations that you would advertise for an estate sale?
Um,
Like, are there like I don't know if you know that like okay, I'm gonna say chat boards, but I know you're not into
uh,
the technology side. Is it the newspaper? Is it
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, um, I'm using Calgary as the example, but
yeah.
I know we're reaching a little farther afield here. Um, but using Calgary as the example, there might be 10 or 12 established estate sale companies within the city of Calgary. And most of them, if they have a track record, they accumulate email addresses, and that's their main form of advertising is talking to customers, and then also signage. Just
Mm-hmm.
a good estate sale company, there's no such thing as too many signs. And incidentally, it helps if the property that the sale is at happens to be within a good place that you could lead people to the sale, makes it that much easier. But just like everything, there are what I consider to be well-run estate sale businesses, and then some not so much. There was one recently of a very prominent Albertan, and I happened to encounter some people that had purchased from that sale, and it was obvious to me that whoever was conducting the sale had very, very little idea as to value of things.
Yeah.
So the things I was shown were fetching a fraction of what they really should have been priced.
Are there things that you can look for when you're vetting, you know, an agent that's going to
Um,
be running your estate sale?
References are a good idea, although if you're keeping an eye on the market, you can generally see who's running the most sales, the most productive sales. This one I was referring to, I'd never heard of the company
Mm-hmm.
before, and who knows, maybe it was their first, and instead of hiring someone like me that has a grasp of the marketplace, they were just winging it, and they clearly were winging it. So I saw one purchase that was, oh gosh, a fraction, just a tiny fraction of what the secondary market could demand for the same items.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's another operator within the city of Calgary that I've encountered over the years many, many times. People, the estate sale company money after the sale, which leads me to believe, why would you have the sale if it's gonna cost you to have the sale? It makes no sense whatsoever. You'd be better off to just take the things and off to the tip.
So is percentage?
It's normally a percentage and a flat fee, depending on how much work. Sometimes an estate sale company, and the one I work primarily with, can sometimes go in and do a couple weeks worth of cleanup.
Mm-hmm.
Often they'll have a dumpster outside, and it's a combination of a house clearing cleanup and then ultimately the best and most valuable items get priced and sold.
Okay.
And even the best estate sale has leftovers at the end, and often that's a donation situation. And I'll get to that in a moment. Some of the other uh, options for selling goods, especially if you just have a few, maybe some of the more valuable items, is to list them online. So Kijiji, eBay, Facebook Marketplace come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not my world. I'm kick the tires and look the person in the eye kind of a person, and that's my background. But for some people, that's an option. Unfortunately, I think you could, in many households, you could spend your whole life uh, listing things online and still not make a dent. So
Side note for safety wise, in Calgary here, if it's small enough that you can stick it in your car, the Calgary police are happy to have you do the exchange in their parking lot. So if you don't want somebody coming to your house, that is always an option. So, okay,
yeah,
continue.
interesting. One of the other things that comes to mind are consignment shops, of which, once again, to use our local market here, there's several that will take clothes if they're stylish and high end and in good condition.
Mm-hmm.
But like a lot of things, that's a tiny, tiny fraction of what's in a normal closet. Same thing with furniture. And I had the opportunity to recently deal with it was a very valuable piece of property and unbelievably furnished, but the furniture was not what the consignment shop considered to be the most saleable furniture. It was more traditional,
Mm-hmm.
and they declined what turned out to be a pretty good auction consignment, as it turned out, but wouldn't take it on consignment at the consignment shop. So, as you're starting to hear, there's a lot of finicky aspects to downsizing. Now, one of the aspects that's quite viable is to just straight donate.
Yep.
And we all have favorite causes, be it a church, a veterans organization. In Calgary, there's Women in Need. There's a variety of different shops that are happy to, in some instances, come and pick up things.
Mm-hmm.
But mostly it's a donation and you get it to the charity that of your choice. Occasionally, and this is where I get involved often, is when things go to a museum or a historical society, something like that. Occasionally, there's a tax receipt involved if it's a historical item or an item of value.
Mm-hmm.
I quite often am doing tax receipts for charitable donations.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a possibility. And then there's the ultimate, and sadly, a lot of things are going to end up in the just to be going to the dump.
So
Yeah.
we have a question about that.
Yes.
You know, nobody wants, I mean, you don't want to see the items that you love go to the dump, but there are a lot of people don't want to clutter up the dump because, you know, it's still usable. It's wasteful.
Yeah.
Is there any way around that?
In a lot of instances, no.
I'm gonna
And
no. Sorry.
yeah. And often I'll tell people, if it's not going to fetch, I don't know, $5 or $10 in a thrift store, the most expedient way is to just hire a construction bin and deal with it. Now, incidentally, that can serve a multitude of purposes. So if it's just sadly things that don't have any further value to them, it can be you deal with it once. From somebody handles it from where they grab it and they take it out to the front yard and pop it in the bin, never to be touched again.
Expediency.
Yes. And when it comes right down to it, one of the big um, question marks or one of the big equations would be weighing the value of your time and effort against the potential monetary value. And sometimes it's a tough decision, but more often than not, um, the balance is if you look at it from a point of view, is it worth all that effort and expense
Mm-hmm.
and time for what you're going to net in the end? Sometimes that makes the decision much more clear. So um, that's the sad part of downsizing occasionally.
We just did that. It's hard.
Yes, it's
It's
very
very
hard.
hard.
Yeah, it is because often we're dealing with things that are so sentimental, and especially if they've been in your family
Yeah.
for a generation or more, it's really tough to just pack up a box and drop it off at the thrift store. It's really a tough thing to do. But it also, on the other end, and I think we were talking beforehand,
Mm-hmm.
it can be very liberating as well. It can give you some freedom when it is done.
Yeah.
And the alternative often is to just do nothing. And ultimately, somebody's going to have to do something. So I personally believe it's much better to downsize and to do the difficult tasks on your own terms than it is to leave it to a point where maybe you're not physically capable of doing it. Maybe your spouse or mate can't physically do it, and it's not the sort of thing that most people want to leave to, say, the somebody handling an estate or to their children to do. It's much better to do it on your own terms if you can.
Mm-hmm. I know we had a previous presentation talking about the downsizing but we were talking about the family aspect of it. And kids not always being available when you have to move. I know with my parents, they put the house up, it sold in 24 hours and then they had a month to
Ah,
do. So they had started it, but that month was still a lot. It was a lot. And I'm working and I can only do so much. And my sister couldn't come out. So with that in mind, and not wanting to have that time constraint, because there's a lot of emotions between families. Kind of timeline would you kind of
oh boy, that's such an individual question. But
yeah.
in a way, it's almost good that you had a month. A month isn't so short that you're panicking, but there's some finality to it. So, part of this whole downsizing question is how do I get started? And
Mhm.
that often is the toughest question is just the initial what starts the process? And maybe often there's no ultimate date that it has to be done by, and maybe that's good and bad. Um, but I will tell you, I take great pride in giving back to my community.
Mhm.
My community has been very good to me, and love I love what I do, and I love the people. And so I mentioned earlier I do benefit auctions for a variety of causes, and that warms my heart. And my name is out there, and I would say, on the average of a couple at least a week
Mhm.
of someone will contact me and say, I have this or I have these items. Often I'll give them my email address, and it's a wee bit of my time. And I'll say, I always caution people that, don't shoot the messenger, because more often than not, it's not an easy or valuable item or an easy item to deal with.
Mhm.
But as long as they don't mind one man's opinion, and that's probably, I should add that, be it a estate sale, an auction sale, um, consignment shop, there's a host of people out there around the fringes. So perhaps they run an estate sale company, or they run a consignment shop or they have an antiques mall, phone around. You know, if you're going to take if you're going to go you're thinking, gee, maybe I'll go the estate sale route.
Mhm.
Well, phone around to some of the antique shops or some of the local people. It's not that large a community, even in a city the size of Calgary. The word is out, and you'll say, well, I'm going to use uh, XYZ company. Have you heard of them? And often they have. And you'll get an opinion, probably favorable, sometimes not. And that information's out there. And I do a lot of pro bono, meaning I don't charge people to tell them sadly that their dining room suite has a nominal value and that um, perhaps the bottom of a buffet hutch has a little bit of value because it's going to be painted and used as a bathroom vanity in its next life.
Don't think about that.
But yes,
Yeah, yeah, I know.
yeah. So take some creativity, and every situation is quite unique. Um, but there are people out there that are willing to spend a little time, and I like to think I'm one of them, that will give you a little bit of at least one man's opinion, hopefully an educated opinion, as to how you get to the next stage.
Now you specialize, you said specifically, we've talked about art and we've talked about furniture.
Yes.
Let's talk about collections a little bit. So, you know, trains, comic books, coins, watches. You've spent your life collecting and you think it's an investment. Those take a while to move.
Yes and no. Um, okay, let's take a look at, or let's talk about some of the items you suggested. And the world's become a very specialized place. So you mentioned coins, for example.
Mhm.
Well, there are people that's their entire business and their entire passion is just strictly coins. And coins is quite cut and dry. Let's talk about Canadian coins. There's a book out there, Scott's, that has every single coin ever produced by the Canadian Mint and even pre-mint. Now, the question is, what's the is it a fine grade? Is it and if I own it, it's extra fine, and if you own it, it's good. So there's a little bit of subjectivity to it,
Mhm.
but coins, for the most part, are fairly easily dealt with.
Okay.
There are buyers out there. There's the possibility of finding another collector and coming to some sort of arrangement, or there's the possibility of dealing with a coin shop, a dealer, and they're buying constantly.
Okay.
So coins are easily dealt with, and they're small. And that's one of the beauties of dealing with things that, a lot of times people will collect they'll start a collection and when they travel, for example, they'll pick up fountain pens. Once again, fairly easily dealt with. You mentioned trains, and they do come up at some of the estate sales occasionally. And I had a gentleman approach me just recently. He's been a lifelong train collector, has probably literally tens of thousands of dollars invested in his little trickier to deal with trains, but there are collectors clubs, at least two within the city of Calgary that I'm aware of, and they're a good source of maybe information and potential buyers as well.
Mhm.
Furniture or large bulky things, for the most part, are a little trickier. And um, although, there's exceptions to the rule, mid-century modern is such a hot commodity these days that virtually any of the avenues that I talked about, estate sales, auction sale companies, consignment shops, would grab vintage pieces that fall into that category without hesitation. I would be very impressed with the prices they get for those sorts of things. But most of what used to be considered classic antiques, Canadiana, that sort of thing, really tough sell. And it's heartbreaking,
Mhm.
especially when you add the sentimentality occasionally with it as well. And you think, gosh, there's this dining table and chairs, and you think about the meals that family meals that happened around that suite over the decades, and all of a sudden it has such a nominal value.
Mhm.
Sometimes it has some value, but to use the example of a Canadiana dining table, well, the exceptional one with the claw feet and in good condition, and maybe it has two or three additional extension leaves. Gosh, it used to be an easy slam dunk, $1,500 at an auction sale, in the right auction sale.
Mhm.
And sadly, now when I'm looking at that same table, pricing it for an estate sale, we might ask 250. And if it hasn't sold at the start of the sale, if it goes down to the last day, often it's 50%. So it's 125, and if it hasn't sold on that last day, it's going to the charity of the owner's choice. So it's not the market that it used to be.
So, there's a lot of different things that people collect. And I had one person has suggested finding contacts ahead of time. So you're not ready to get rid of it, but you know, whether it's coin collectors or it's Royal Doulton China or
Mhm.
whatever it might be. Um, how do you go about finding these? Like, is it a internet search? Is it a phone book? I don't, do we still have phone books?
These
I don't know.
these days, these days it is the internet, and and normally if you find one collector and she or he is a serious collector, she'll have other contacts as well. It used to be, well, you use the example of Royal Dolt. So when I was a retailer, I had a cabinet full of Dolton figurines, and I had several price books. And if a particular piece, maybe it was discontinued in the 1960s and they never, and it was a scarce piece, maybe it had a value assigned to it that was $500 for this little figurine.
Mhm.
Um, the market changed in the 90s, in the late 90s especially, where it became the case, and it still is today, that one prices if Royal Doulton figurines and assortment come up at an estate sale, might be 25 or $40 across the board,
Mhm.
and nobody really pays much attention. At least the sellers don't pay much attention as to what year it was discontinued and what the former book value was. It's just try and move these Royal Doulton figurines, and sadly, sometimes they're gone on the first day, but sometimes they're sitting around waiting for the thrift store at the end as well. There's where there used to be a very reliable market. So it really does depend on the collection of what the items are. And I will make the point of, and this is an observation, and no one's ever explained it to me, but I've observed it over a career, is that what's collectible at one time period, and when I speak of this, I usually think back to when I was a young man and off to university, and my parents would have a Canadiana auction, and often one of the more interesting things within uh, what you might see in a Canadian household of the time would be oil lamps. And if you were a little more particular, perhaps you had a patterned oil lamp. So it might be a tulip pattern or it might be a bullseye pattern. Or if you wanted, you had a little finger lamp, which was so even in the 1970s, the right oil lamps might fetch 100 or 150, or that bullseye finger lamp might be $200 in 1975 Canadian dollars.
Mhm.
Heck, I think my parents, that helped put me through university. And the reason why somebody would pay those sorts of dollars for a lamp, because they were collectors. Somebody had grown up with oil lamps in their home, or for sure their parents had, or their grandparents had. Now you fast forward several decades. We're filming Canadian pickers, and left, right, and center, half the places we go to have oil lamps. They might have one, they might have 50. Nobody cares anymore. That sentimentality, that nostalgia was eliminated. And if somebody had an oil lamp collecting a collection, they they want to sell it, or their descendants want to sell it.
Mm-hmm.
So you fast forward to today, and all of a sudden it's I don't know, Lego, or the most collectible thing of today. My point is that my nostalgia is not your nostalgia.
You need to find a
And
market.
yes, and it changes. And I've seen over my career a lot of things that have come and become very desirable and then fallen off the cliff.
Mm-hmm.
So um,
Timing.
timing is very important. Now, that said, if you're a collector of a certain item, especially if it's small, maybe that's not something that's so important in the downsizing world. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's what one thing you want to take with you if you're going into a smaller condo or a senior's residence or something like that. If it's small, that presents a lot less difficulty than if it's something bulky again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I mean, we're open for questions still. If anybody has any questions, I think we've covered the ones. Too many of us thrift stores are declining donations. So yeah, unfortunately, we are probably looking at things going to the dump, which is too bad. We covered this one. Could you have filling up the landfills? Somebody was asking about silver. So if you are looking to do precious metals, is there a specific industry that you would want to go and find?
Yes. Initially, it's good to have somebody um, with some knowledge to identify things. So we talked earlier about silver.
Mhm.
And silver, I would say about 999 out of 1,000 pieces of silver that I see are marked. And um, because silver, if you look to, let's say, to Great Britain and several other countries, but silver was and still is to a certain degree a form of currency, if you will.
Mhm.
So it was very important to be marked. But I probably have in excess of, at least a half a dozen different silver books with marks. So I have ones that are standard English hallmarks.
Mhm.
Um, and if one knows how to read the marks, I can tell that the piece was made in a specific year, and the assay office was a specific location, be it Birmingham or London or Chester. And I can tell who the monarch is there, which means that the duty was paid. It tells quite the story just looking at the marks, but it's a language of its own.
Mhm.
And then it gets a little more broad. So I have other books that have European marks, and every country had its own style or way of marking things. And it can get quite detailed. And then occasionally there's something that's not marked,
Mhm.
but could very well have sterling content to it.
Mhm.
So in other words, it's a quite a conundrum. So it's of benefit to find somebody initially to just identify what you
Mhm.
have. Then it's simply, if you do have something of value, so it's silver, and by silver that might mean that, as I said before, maybe it's marked 800, which is 80% silver as opposed to our sterling standard of 92.5%.
Mhm.
There are bullion dealers. Some of them are established with shops and reputations, good or bad, mostly good, but the occasional not so much. And then there are people that travel around from town to town buying. And so you're not quite sure who you're dealing with, and that may be good or bad.
Would it be worthwhile to contact somebody? So here in Calgary, we've got Heritage Park and like ask them, do you have a dealer in this, or do you know any contacts or museums
Yes.
or?
And often I'll get a referral and it will have come through that route.
Okay.
Because Heritage Park, they have their curators, but most of them are not specialists
But they
say
would
so.
probably, so if there's
Correct.
anybody that is either has a collection on display, say in a museum, they could probably direct you to.
Yes, and if they're items of potentially good value, it becomes actually easier because there's, it's not to take your first offer per se, but sometimes there's two or three different places you could take it and get two or three different offers on the same item.
Okay.
Art is interesting in that um, virtually every piece of art with value. So let's use, I don't know, pull it out of the air, more than a few $100 value that has gone through an auction house. So once again, to use Calgary as an example, there's two auction houses in Calgary that specialize in selling art at auction. Those two auction houses, and probably 30 or 40 more across Canada, and probably 30,000 across the world, will submit their prices on an annual basis. And meaning that, let's call it, pull a figure out of the air, but maybe a 500,000 pieces of art in a given year will be recorded that sell at auction. So to use a local example, well-known Calgary artist Roland Gissing, that piece of art might have gone through one of the local auction houses. It would be listed as a Gissing. Perhaps it has a mountain scene, a title to it. The size is 24 by 36. The medium is an oil painting. The condition is excellent. It's framed and it's sold for, let's call it $1,500 last week at auction.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually um, subscribe to that information on an annual basis and pull up virtually any piece of art sold, not just this year or last year, but for several decades. And to use that same example of Gissing the artist, maybe over the last 3 or 4 decades, there are, I would say several hundred pieces listed. So it's quite defined.
Yeah.
Which means that if you have a piece of art and you're not sure about it, you could go to one of those two auction houses or some other dealers as well, and they have access to that information, and they can give you not an exact figure, but they could give you a ballpark as to what your painting might fetch at auction in the secondary market.
Okay.
Which is valuable information, which you can't do in very many other fields. No.
All right, let's see what we got. A lot of Chinese antiques, mostly porcelain. Some are bronze, that are 200 to 300 years old. Best way to deal with those?
I've encountered this question several times over the decades, and it's a bit of a tricky one for a couple of reasons. One, I keep referring to my home market.
That's the one you know best.
It's the one I know best, and it's the one I deal and wheel in. And it's not the biggest market, but it's sizable, in excess of 1 million people starts to become, but couple things. First of all, Asian pieces are often marked, but they're often, and I won't use the word copied. I've heard it referred to that it's an association or a complement to a previous dynasty, for example, to put, um, which,
Homage.
yes, which makes it a little tricky unless you're qualified and experienced and you've handled a lot of like pieces. And I think of myself as quite qualified and experienced, but not in Asian collectibles. Not that I haven't sold my fair share over time, but I wouldn't call myself an expert by any means. I encountered a piece just in the last week, and it wasn't an Asian piece, it was an English piece of earthenware that I looked at it, and at first blush, I thought it was a Victorian piece. So we're talking 1830 to 1903. Um, and then upon closer inspection, and a couple things were pointed out to me. I thought, you know what? I've never seen a reproduction of that before.
Mm-hmm.
But once something starts to have some value to it, somebody else is out there reproducing it.
Gotcha.
So Asian antiques, Chinese antiques are a field unto themselves. And here's where it becomes even more difficult is a city the size of Calgary. I don't know of one person that I would call the definitive expert.
So in this case, if they contacted, say, a museum to see if they know of a contact, maybe other parts
Perhaps,
of Canada that they could
perhaps,
connect with?
or I mentioned that I was an expert on the Canadian Roadshow, Canadian Antiques Roadshow. There is a gentleman out on the West Coast, actually he splits his time between the West Coast and Toronto, that is a definitive expert.
Okay.
It's a background, and I can't remember, I think it was Sotheby's, and that's all he deals in.
Okay.
So might be a stretch, but if I was able to source him, depending on what the items are.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also depending on where does it say where our,
No,
yeah,
that's
Yes.
okay.
yeah.
So when we're done here, I'll make sure that your information,
Mhm.
when we send out to the registrants and when we put it up so that there's contact information that people can reach out for different things.
Sure. I'd like to mention something though that just came to mind and actually addresses this question as well, is the world has changed so much that a good percentage of the transactions, things on the secondary market, be it used furniture or clothing or a multitude of things, change hands based upon an image on a screen, which um, is so foreign and I can't wrap my head around that, but that's reality.
Yeah.
And so the gentleman or the lady that asked about the Chinese antiques, I could say, well, send me a photo. But really, until one handles something,
Yeah.
some things are recognizable. So I mentioned that, I don't know, Canadiana dining table earlier. Even though I've seen reproductions of it, I think based on the photo, especially if I asked for a closer photo of certain things,
Mhm.
maybe the hardware or something like that, I could determine the age of that table. When it comes to a lot of things, including artworks,
Mhm.
I'm amazed at how many things are purchased sight unseen. Yes, you've got an image on a screen, and I've sat there literally and watched thousands upon thousands of pieces of art sold, some of which I have the microphone in my hand and my gavel in my other hand, and I'm selling them. And there's the image on the screen behind me. There's the image in a printed catalog. There's the image on a laptop or a computer screen. And then the actual piece is sitting there in front of me on an easel. And sometimes the piece on the easel, often, is much more attractive than the images, the other images, and it works both ways. But for sure, color and scale and just the feel of a piece and the framing, it astounds me. If it were but a few $100s, well, okay, you take your chances. But
Yeah.
often it's several thousands and sometimes many thousands of dollars where the buyer sees the piece for the first time right after they pay for it, which goes so far against my
So
training, my
sellers,
suggestions. Yes.
those are options. Great. Do
Yes.
buyers?
Buyers caveat emptor. And I
Gotcha.
used to teach a class, a continuing ed class through the University of Calgary called Antiques, Art, and Auction. And if people took away one thing from all those classes that we would go to, if they took away one thing, is don't buy something sight unseen. And I consider an image on a screen as virtually sight unseen.
And the younger populations, that's all we do. It's called Amazon.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We got a couple more questions. I heard that one can donate china sets, teacups, glassware to places that specialize in high tea. Have you heard this?
No.
Oh.
I used to have a client that had an unbelievable country home, and he would every teacup and saucer that I would ever have, he would buy for me at a nominal fee
Mhm.
and put on high tea. But I must confess, I haven't heard or seen that for quite some time. And one of the local interactive museums in the city here used to have a program where they would sell their things through their vintage or heritage program. And then the things at the end of the season that hadn't sold, they would break them all into pieces and sell them by the box, and people would do mosaics out of them.
Cool.
Yes, but it gives you an indication that there's not a great deal of value there. So,
Okay.
sadly, unless a tea service had some historical significance, I don't know of anything that exists other than the nominal secondary market.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I've got one here. It said, is there any value in solid maple Broxton furniture?
That's a tough one. I price Roxton rock maple, they used to call it. Very, very fine. I grew up with it. That was what was in my bedroom was maple furniture, and I believe it was Roxton, to tell you the truth. And I believe that it doesn't exist today because the cost of manufacturing made the what you'd have to price it prohibitive. It was never inexpensive furniture. It was always very pricey. The sad part is about maple furniture, it's almost always that classical colonial style. And sadly, colonial style is not what's in vogue.
Mhm.
So if a piece is say, a cedar lined chest, that's more desirable in most cases as opposed to the colonial tables and chairs and other associated items.
Mhm.
So, um, sadly, and I do price it with a little bit of a premium as opposed to other secondary market furniture, but that's on the hope that if it's a table and chairs, it's somebody else that has that same table and chairs, and maybe they have a set and they have 4 chairs and they want to add another 4 to it.
Mhm.
But realistically, it falls into the depressed category of furniture.
So before we end this, then the overall advice would be to start early and do some research before you need to actually do that downsize?
Yes, I would use the telephone. I would speak to as many people as you possibly could. If it's going to be the estate sale and the route that you go, I would want to interview two or three different ones and maybe ask for some references or maybe try and get actually independent references. I'm I'm so sorry that I'm the bearer of bad news, to tell you the truth, because more often than not, um, it's not the easiest thing to do. We talked about, and it's not a happy situation. And I feel like I'm selling funeral plots or something of that nature. Um, but it's reality. And I think a lot of people, sooner or later, be it themselves or their parents, sooner or later, we're all going to have to deal with it. And I don't believe it's going to get any easier to deal with. In fact, I anticipate it's going to get more difficult to deal
Yeah.
with.
We had somebody say that at the top of the presentation that there's just, we're at the tip of the iceberg for the boomers starting to downsize.
Yes, yes, I think there's a tsunami of downsizing coming, and we're just at the start of it. So don't shoot the messenger. Use him for some advice if it can help.
It's inside trading, so to speak.
Yes,
Do it early,
yes,
please.
absolutely.
You know what's coming.
Yeah.
It's always better to be in the know than surprised.
Yes, and then I find the hardest part is just getting started.
Yeah.
Come up with talk to people, talk to more people, talk to friends that have done it and gone through the process, come up with a game plan, and then swiftly execute it. That's my best advice.
Thank you so much. I
Oh,
appreciate you joining us.
it's been a pleasure.